This is a Mercury MK25E, 1954 and a half. It's still the old Mark 20 green and Mark 20 silver. Same lower unit. And the power head was improved quite a bit. The carburetor works a lot better, and the ignition system is certainly more reliable. It's a Phelon. It was standard. This is an electric start model with the original starter motor, and the engine runs very, very well. The starter motor, well, let's just say I have lots upstairs that are not worth much. The gears tended to wear out of them, and you will hear it cranking over and understand why. It's on a PB10, I do believe, Custom Craft. It was a kit boat offered by Custom Craft, and when Mr. Canuzzi decided to build fiberglass boats, he sold all his wooden boat kits to his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law, I think, is the Clark Craft Company, is still in business, or was up till a few years ago. I bought this kit in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and my son and I built the boat together. And when I got it, I looked at the plywood on the case that it came in. It certainly wasn't cardboard. The plywood in the case was better than anything you could buy today, and I said, man, this thing must be an old kit. When I took it apart, it was nothing about Clark Craft at all in the directions. It was all Custom Craft, so that's why I know what it is and where it came from. But this engine, as I say, runs quite well, and they're a nice performing engine. Came out 6 months after the Mark 20. This particular one is an electric start, World War II Infinal connector. It had a swinging arm Bendix starter made by Delco, which was not very good. Probably the one thing in the engine that wasn't a vast improvement over the Mark 20. This has a Phelon ignition and pretty much foolproof compared to the Bendix Scintilla. The engine was put on mounts, so it's quite a bit more isolated, and the vibration is isolated for the boat a great deal more than the Mark 20. The controls, the gear shift comes in the same way that the throttle does. On the Mark 20, it came across, so you had one cable going off in one direction and another in the other. And it has a electric start, which you have to turn on. That's off, that's on, and that's start. Turns like a regular key, but in order to use your control box, you had to turn the key on, and then you had, on the control box, you had a start button and a choke button. And this was also a change, went from K-Matic controls to Quicksilver controls. And that's Quicksilver's stayed to this day. This is the Mark 25 starter motor assembly right here. This is the way it was sold as the starter motor assembly. It has a little tiny, I do believe, offset and gear reduction pinion right there. Back end. The early Mark 50s, I do believe, were positive ground too. I don't think this one was. Listed in the starter motor section of the old manual, there are two different starter motors listed. And I think it was one of them had the bracket and one of them didn't. The Mark 25 didn't. And then it had a starter mechanism, which was separate, and there were two different ones of those. Most of the parts are common. It was, to say the least, it was a terrible starter motor. Very noisy when you hear it crank over. And these, the Bendix itself, they failed a lot. I noticed in my parts. I bought out a dealer who was in one of the biggest dealers in Maine in the early 50s. He had 5 or 6 of these swing arm gears in stock, so my guess is they probably tried to make this thing work by changing stuff around, but it really never succeeded. And the starter motor mounts on the Mark 25 on a bracket, which is also the fuel pump. This is the starter motor disassembled. As you can see, there's a gear at the end of this, and that drives this other gear, which is a gear reduction, and there's your top gear, which drives the swing arm. And you can see the brushes in here. They're fairly complex. It's a complex engine. It's assembled with, I would guess, World War II parts where money was no object. This is the field. It's a 2-brush starter motor. Like I say, they're way too complicated, and they really don't work all that well. They do work, but not very well. They're very noisy and very prone to wear. This is the fuel pump right here, and this is the bracket right here. You can see where the gasket goes, and you can also see where the diaphragm and the inner gaskets were. So the starter motor has to be assembled with the starter motor on the bottom, and then it's bolted through, and the mechanism right here is held in place by a roll pin, which you can see right there, and you can see the notch for it right there. There, the starter motor is assembled on the bracket for the Mark 25, and this moves with the inertia. This whole thing swings when you fire it up, and that's this piece right here. Right here is the stop, and it's a great big long spring. It goes all the way around and is fastened over on this side, so it has some shock absorption. This is the setup as it sits at when the voltage is applied to the starter motor. The inner gear walks on this gear that's attached to this shaft and rotates the whole thing into the flywheel. And these things had very fine little teeth. The later ones did not. And a lot of times you'd find them broken with broken teeth, either on this piece right here or on the flywheel itself. And unfortunately, with a fuel pump mounted on the starter motor bracket and a starter motor which was not great, it added to a lot of extra work. One of the drawbacks to this engine, again, as I say, was the swing arm Bendix starter motor, and it's mounted on the side of the engine that's really difficult to take off. And there was way too much stuff there. The engine's really hard to work on, the electric start version. Without the electric start, the engine's pretty clean, and that side doesn't need to be removed very often, but on this one, it does. So, because the starter motor didn't work very well, and we'll crank it over here in just a minute. And we're about to crank it over with the swing arm Bendix starter motor. It's very noisy, and every one I've ever encountered was the same as this one. It's been a few years. We're going to turn on the key, and we can start it here. You can hear it. sounds pretty horrid, doesn't it? But the engine started well, so usually you didn't have to crank it for very long. Or we'll turn on the key and we can use the starter button here. Pretty nasty, huh? Time to start it. Turn on the key. Press the start. Engine has a good idle.